So, what I've been trying to argue in this section on research is that the remaking of the public is played out around a number of different struggles. It's not one logic, privatisation, but a plurality of competing logics that create spaces within which new struggles might be possible. How then do we engage in such struggles? And this is, I'm struggling for language here. I don't want to create a duality between the university as the home of the public intellectual and the rest of the public sphere peopled with reflexive practitioners and politicians hungry for the latest crumbs from the academic table. Nor do I want, I'm afraid, to participate in a one-way system of knowledge transfer. And that's an in-joke for those at the Open University. The work of rethinking and remaking the public comes out of relationships that are active and engaged. One of the best public intellectuals I know, Carol Hart, is a leader of a small voluntary organisation run by women in Birmingham who's very skilled at going out and engaging people, including but not confined to academics, bringing ideas back, finding the money to send members off to big events such as the Beijing Conference and the World Social Forum, and mediating new ideas into politics and not only local politics. Nevertheless, universities continue to form a privileged site for intellectual activity, albeit not as privileged as it used to be. What are the intellectual resources we can work with? Now, when I was thinking about this question, I went to the library and I found an issue of a journal called New Formations devoted to this topic, the role of the public intellectual. And I seized on it avidly. One of the contributors, Andrew Gamble, says lots of good things, but his central argument is this: public intellectuals are those who are committed to the idea of the public domain itself and the essential values for its continuance, such as openness, rationality, diversity, clarity, and tolerance. Now, the research I've been describing suggests that each of those concepts may be lacking. Openness implies a kind of cultural universalism that was problematized by those excluded from the social settlement, and those challenges were picked up by critical professionals such as us in the libraries at the time. Rationality is one of the characteristics of the Habermasian conception of a democratic public sphere that has been widely criticized by feminists and others as excluding particular voices and forms of expression, and that was one of the big findings from the project on public participation. Clarity was never a characteristic of the social democratic state. The distinction between politics and administration was always deeply muddy and has become more muddy in the context of network governance. And that was one of the issues that I tried to raise in that section on, with the quotes from the managers. Concepts of accountability are actually very confused. Even as an aspiration, clarity diminishes the validity of affective or emotional dimensions of publicness that do not lend themselves to the job description or contract. In fact, just take you back to the research on cleaners, right? They were willing to work beyond their job description or contract at some points. Changing relationships and conditions squeeze that capacity. Diversity is, of course, a noble aspiration, but tends to be institutionalized in forms that categorize publics into discrete groups. And the public participation project and the library example both suggest how that happens. And in the process, as Wendy Brown argues, publics are detached from the politics that produce them. I quote, "Historical conflicts are rendered as essential ones, effects become cause, and culture, religion, ethnicity, or sexuality become entrenched differences with entrenched interests." Now, I'm not even going to try to talk about tolerance, because this was the focus of Wendy Brown's lecture here a month or so back, and I can't hope to capture the subtlety of her argument. But it's nevertheless clear that in the library work, our early engagement with multiculturalism was marred by forms of tolerance that served in part to reassert the hegemony of the white norm. Each term, then, of these is open to critical constructivism. But I don't want to suggest that words can mean anything you want them to mean. They're all part of the discursive chain that forms the lifeblood of liberalism. And as such, our task is to both deconstruct them in order to make the choices more visible and indicate why they matter, but also to engage with the work of redefining them in the context of contemporary struggles and defending them from other forms of appropriation. For example, those that collapse the discourse of diversity into an ethos of individualised choices in the marketplace, or those that take openness out of its association with the liberal public sphere, however flawed, and suture it into the new discourses of opportunity and choice. It should not just be up to Tony Blair and Tessa Jowell to redefine equality and justice for a modern age. But this form of discursive work in itself is not enough. We need forms of critical theory that can engage with what Nancy Fraser calls hard cases, like the cases that I put up at the beginning, the Sikh protest in Birmingham, things around the increasing significance of religious affiliations and identity in national and global conflicts, new forms of populist politics, and so on. What I have in mind is the kind of work done by Davina Cooper in her analyses of the disruptions that take place on the boundaries of legitimate government and that demonstrate how that boundary is regulated and policed. We also need to address the problems of analysing the public in post-colonial and globalised world where the capacity of the nation-state to bestow the identities, if not the entitlements of citizenship, is under question, and in which new social movements have challenged the cultural universalism implied in the concept of a unified public sphere. So, what kinds of ways of thinking might we have to tell us how to think about the public in this context? And I'm not going to do these in any detail, but there's about 6 headings here I just want to mention as ways in which I think it's important to build things into our theorising. Such an approach would have to understand the public as complexly spatialised rather than delimited by nation states. And here I'm thinking of the kind of work done by cultural geographers at the Open University. The public as produced through multiple histories and struggles, but in a way, as in the Wendy Brown quote, that doesn't essentialise differences or strip them from the politics to which they were produced. And I'm thinking here of the kind of work done by colleagues in the social policy discipline, their work on social settlements and their dismantling. The public as a site of belonging and exclusion. And this sort of work is marked in particular by people like Sarah Neal, who's working on issues of race and rurality, and Gail Lewis, whose work on post-colonial issues of race and belongingness is opening up new research agendas. The public as relational and experiential. Now, you can see this creeping into the language of policy documents. But I want that to be relational and experiential, but not individuated into a multitude of service-specific encounters or communitized relationships. The public as something which is constituted in governmental practice, but also something which is voiced and claimed, while recognising that not all claims are of equal value. And finally, for this slide, the public is produced through social and political practice. For example, the publics that were being produced in public participation strategies. Practice through which claims can be struggled for and in which judgments between different claims might be made. And this opens up the arguments of people like Nancy Fraser about the relationship between the politics of recognition and redistribution, and leads to important questions about how we redefine democracy and democratic practice, but they are concepts that I'm not going to talk about. Thank goodness, you're all going to say.